the good old summertime, in the good old summertime, rolling through...
Hello and welcome to part 2 of this Golden Age of Cricket episode on the early years of the life and career of Australia's Charlie Macartney. If you'd like to support the podcast, you're welcome to make a small donation. Please visit buymeacoffee.com/goldenageofcricket. We now return to the discussion with biographer Peter Lloyd during Charlie's maiden test series, The Ashes of 1907-08. As tradition dictated, the third test moved to the very picturesque Adelaide Oval for the 1907-08 series, and history remembers this match for the match-saving partnership between Clem Hill and Roger Hartigan. But we can easily forget that Macartney, young Charlie Macartney, top scored for Australia in the first innings with his 75 coming in at first drop. So again, he moves around in the batting order, this time batting at number 3. Was this the innings, Peter, which perhaps cemented Macartney in the Australian side?
I think McCartney's place in the Test 11 was really assured by his form in the first two tests of the series. With only 2 days separating the second and third tests, 2 changes were made to the Australian side with the dropping of the unfortunate Jerry Hazlitt uh, and the inclusion of Queenslander Roger Hartigan and the forced replacement of the injured Tibby Cotter by debutant Jack O'Connor. Charlie must have been kicking himself when he was dismissed LBW to Wilfred Rhodes for 75 and 153 minutes with 9 fours. He did bat at first drop, replacing Clem Hill, who'd had a severe dose of the flu and showed a degree of coolness rarely exhibited by a Test newcomer. His bowling was also impressive when he collected 2 wickets for 49 runs off 18 overs. The ever so miserly Warwick Armstrong bowled the same number of overs and conceded 55 runs. So Charlie further cemented his position in the Australian 11, I guess you could put it that way. I think he was well established now as a core member of the team, and he continued to impress.
Yeah, indeed. And just to elaborate on my question and your answer, because the two facts might seem a bit contradictory, but yes, Clem Hill came down with a nasty bout of the flu, moved down the order, but then put on what is regarded as one of the great all-time Test performances. I think he hit 160 battling the heat. It was about 40 degrees. He had the flu and put on a huge partnership with Hartigan. But that in itself is the reason why Charlie Macartney moved to number 3 in the batting order, which was traditionally Clem Hill's position. So with Macartney all but confirmed in terms of his position in the Australian side, and it seems like he would be in a good position to make the next Ashes tour, which is the tour of 1909. This might be a good time to bring up the ongoing player dispute happening in the country with the Australian Board of Control, which of course continues to rumble for the next few years. What relevance did this have at all in terms of Charlie's early career, Peter?
Oh, Tom, I'd have to say that it didn't really have any impact whatsoever on Charlie at that stage. Um, Along with all the other youngsters in the Australian 11 or those on the periphery, they were totally committed to ensuring their places in the side or being selected as a member of the next Ashes touring party. Charlie would return from the 1909 tour with a deeper understanding, I think, of the tensions between the leading lights and the board, in particular fellow tourists and board man Peter McAllister. As I mentioned earlier, he would also suffer at the selection table in the 1911 and 12 season. But at this point, his whole focus was on playing well and remaining in form and in the team.
Yeah, okay. So nothing yet is happening. So he is selected for the 1909 Ashes Tour to England. But it appears, certainly from my point of view, and perhaps any observer of cricket statistics and selections, that it's a bit of an anticlimax because despite the previous Australian summer where he seems to be establishing himself, Monty Noble then doesn't select him for the opening first class match of the tour, which is against Nottinghamshire at Trent Bridge. And then when he is selected to play against Northamptonshire, he bats at number 11 and he does take 4 wickets, mind you. So what's going on here, Peter? Is this Monty Noble just experimenting before the test matches begin, or is there something greater at play?
Noble's cautious, if we could call it that, use of Charlie's talents at the beginning of the 1909 tour were linked to the little Gordonians' state of physical health. In late October 1908, Charlie was hospitalised and underwent an inguinal hernia repair, a fact which was poorly reported at the time and which I only became aware of when examining his 1916 medical enlistment reports for the war. The lengthy period of recuperation restricted his involvement in Sydney grade cricket for much of the season, especially limiting his appearances at the bowling crease. He played just 4 matches for New South Wales in that season leading into the tour and was nursed along by state skipper Noble. He battled down the order on most occasions, a luxury that the mother state could afford given the depth of talent in the squad, with Warren Bardsley, Noble, Sid Gregory, Bert Hopkins, the Waddy brothers, Austin Diamond, etc., all performing admirably. In the vernacular, Charlie was underdone at the commencement of the Ashes tour, with Noble man managing one of his strike weapons very astutely.
Right. Okay. So I knew you would have the answer, having written biographies on both of these cricketers. So despite this rather slow start to the 1909 Ashes tour for Charlie, he then goes on to play in all 5 Test matches, and it's an Ashes series which is successful for the visiting Australians. But in the first test, again, he is used as a bowler. He opens both innings for Australia as a bowler. And then in the third test at Headingley, he takes 11 wickets for the match. So, how do you assess his maiden test series in England, both from a bowling and a batting perspective?
Uh, so he wasn't the most significant contributor to Australia's series victory, but he was central to Noble's and Armstrong's. Noble and Armstrong worked very closely together as a leadership group. He was central to their strategy. A left arm twirler with control and guile was indispensable. He just needed a conducive wicket. I think the sides were equally matched, but Noble was by far the more capable captain, and he knew perfectly well how to use Charlie's skills with the ball. As I mentioned earlier, Charlie was coming to grips with the conditions as the series unfolded. His attacking style of batting was evolving, and he was on the cusp of dominance. Noble and Armstrong appreciated this, as did a few of the English experts.
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned earlier, something which is perhaps lost slightly in this very cosmopolitan world we live in today is that Noble, his captain for the tour, being a fellow New South Welshman, probably understood Charlie and Charlie's medical history and just his development probably better than most, and was able to utilize him accordingly.
That's true. I think Noble knew his team intimately. I knew the
Mm,
members of the team intimately, knew their strengths and their foibles, and in Charlie's case, he was managed superbly by
mm,
Noble.
yeah. So after returning to Australia from the 1909 Ashes tour, Charlie then makes a decision which, at the time and perhaps even to this day, appears a little strange. He goes to play cricket in Otago, New Zealand, for 4 months. And there doesn't seem to be any clear reason why he did this. Charlie himself offers very little explanation. But what do you think were the motivations behind this move?
Charlie's limited explanation was a single sentence in his biography. So, but I think perhaps because of his father's ambitious plans for him, Charlie was disappointed with his cricketing performances on the 1909 tour. But beyond that, though, and given he had a letter of introduction which was arranged by his father, the government uh, sought to promote Charlie's character and being to authorities in England, naming him as a person of repute and somebody who could be relied upon. And that letter of introduction was an open letter which Charlie could use as he saw fit. However, despite that, there were no real emerging commercial opportunities in England. And I think this probably added to the angst that he perhaps felt about not performing as well as he may have wanted to. He was approached by the New Zealand business entrepreneur and cricket notable, Charles Robert Smith, on the boat over to England. And I think a seed was planted at that time. He was very keen, Charlie was very keen to make his own mark and demonstrate to his father that he had what it took to go it alone and beyond cricket. But when nothing of note happened, he sailed back to Australia in a state of depression. Even then, it took him several days before he was able to journey from Melbourne to Sydney to front up to his family and admit that his ambitions to be an independent adult had come to nothing. He was in a prolonged funk.
A funk indeed, and the 4 months he spent in New Zealand were not that profitable in terms of cricketing form as well. He comes back to Australia having lost what he had gained, I suppose, in England in the preceding cricket seasons. And this drop of form continues into the 1910-11 first-class season, and this season included the home test series against the visiting South Africans. And again, if we look at statistics, and I know statistics aren't everything, but they're very useful in terms of giving us a guide, Charlie doesn't particularly stand out at this point in time. He's dropped for the fourth test against the South Africans in Melbourne, but then he's recalled for the final test in Sydney, where he explodes with 137 in the first innings and then follows up with a half century in the second innings. Was he actually deserving of a test recall for this fifth test, do you think?
I think it's all down to Monty Noble. Monty Noble was very keen to have Charlie back in the 11. Yes, he was going through a form loss, but Noble knew that Charlie's credentials were sufficient for him to bounce back, and he added much dynamism to the side. As I mentioned before, in his autobiography, Charlie insisted that his low scores weren't the result of lack of form, but merely a run of bad luck. His twin tons for New South Wales against the tourists immediately before the fifth test saw him replace South Australian Algie Gears, who'd scored two half centuries in 7 innings across the series, but without overly impressing. So it was Noble's
Hmm.
enthusiasm, Noble's influence on the selectors that brought Charlie back.
Yeah, and he's certainly getting the sense from listening to you, Peter, that what an impact Monty Noble had on certainly the early part of Charlie's career. It's fascinating to hear.
I think
Um,
it went even beyond Charlie, of course, but in
mm,
Charlie's case, Noble saw something special.
mm, absolutely. And it sort of reiterates, again, it's different today, but it reiterates the how almost patriotic or aligned cricketers could be to their state, or even earlier to their colony back in these days. And it happens again with other captains fighting for a particular player who happened to be from the same state or part of Australia from them. It doesn't quite happen these days, but it's certainly, you can see it on many occasions during the Golden Age.
Yes, I think also the going beyond the golden age. I think New South Wales was always seen by other states as being given preferential treatment.
Absolutely. Yes, but we won't go into that. That's a whole
No,
nother
that's a
rabbit hole.
beyond the golden age.
So, Peter, if we again skip to the following season, which is an Ashes tour, this time the English visiting Australia for the 1911-12 series. It's a memorable season for many reasons. Most notable, perhaps, is just the outstanding bowling of Sydney Barnes and Frank Foster for the English side. There's underlying tensions happening between the Australian players and the board, namely Clem Hill and Peter McAllister. And there's the fact that Charlie Macartney finds himself as 12th man for the first 3 tests, and then he's omitted altogether for the 4th test. How do you read what is happening in Charlie's career at this point? Was his non-selection an aberration, or was his international career actually on the brink?
Charlie was very surprised and disappointed to be dropped, and he believed, rightly I think, that he was the victim of a biased selection panel with McAllister and Frank Iredale, both board men, excluding him from the Test 11 for all but the final rubber. Given that he'd only recently displayed his batting wares with much elan at international level, it seems absurd to me that he should have missed out. Even in middling form, he was a far superior batsman to several of those who were selected in the side. I also think he was a far better slower bowler than Tommy Matthews, who
Mm.
had the uh, had the eye of the selectors during that season.
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, in the ensuing rupture which happens between the Australian players and the cricket board results in the infamous Big Six pulling out of the 1912 triangular series in England for the middle of 1912. And it turns out to be a disastrous series for many reasons. Including sort of financial, but weather as well. The cricket's not very good, but it is a successful tour for Charlie Macartney. Was his inclusion on this tour only made possible because of the absence of Clem Hill, Victor Trumper, Armstrong, and the rest?
I don't think so. There are others who may believe this, but of the big six, the only one who was really missed, I think, was Armstrong for both his all round playing ability and for his captaincy. I think of the others, Hill and Trumper wouldn't have toured even if the big six issue hadn't arisen. I think Ransford probably also might not have been uh, available because of his business commitments. I think McCartney would have been among the first selected. He was a real draw card, and as you say, he and Warren Barnsley in particular were the two successful team members on the 12 tour. So no, I think perhaps the Big Six slightly exaggerated in terms of what it meant for the triangular tour. I think Australia probably was unlikely to do much better, even if one or two of the others had been there. I mean, Cotter was past his prime. A couple of others hadn't played first class cricket for quite a while. So selectors were a bit, I think they were a bit hamstrung as to what they might have done. So he was there, I think, at the forefront.
When you wonder what I'd like to wear, send a pretty little curl from the sweetest little girl in my hometown.
It's interesting, Peter, hearing you previously talk so eloquently about the tactical nous of Noble as a captain, specifically on that 1909 Ashes tour. What do you make of Sid Gregory's captaincy for the 1912 season? Because there were numerous reports of disruptions, and Gregory at this point in time is, I think it's like his 7th tour to England or something. What do you make of Sid Gregory as a captain for the 1912 season?
I think it's quite obvious that Sid Gregory was the worst Australian captain ever. Uh,
Right.
and I don't think his style of captaincy suited Charlie whatsoever. He saw Charlie as being a go-to guy, both with bat and ball, and he certainly overbowled Charlie.
Mm.
I can't quite recall, but I do remember a nice anecdote where Sid's complaining about the lack of captaincy in the field to one of the other players, and the other player had to remind him that he was the captain, and he could have intervened. I think it might have been on the 1912 tour.
I like it.
Yeah.
Well, if we return to Charlie's career, so as we lead into the outbreak of the First World War and coming back from his 1912 triangular series, he seems to have regained some of his form. So if we isolate his career at this point in time, pre-World War, how should we assess him as a cricketer? And how do we compare his career at this point in time to, say, a fellow New South Welshman like Victor Trumper?
So I spend a lot of time in the biography identifying quite a few comparisons that journalists and cricketing people make between Trumper and Macartney. If you look at the index in the book, if you're fortunate enough to have a copy, there are about 15 specific examples where the discussion about how the two equate. Maybe I could quote one, if
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't mind, from a column written by J.C. Davis, who was probably the most astute analyst in the press, and probably more astute than some of the cricketers too. Uh, it was in a subheading in the referee under the heading subheading of the equal of Trumper question mark, and this is what J.C. Davis had to say. Charlie Macartney did not travel south with the New South Wales team in 1912-13, so that he has played only in the Sydney matches. In these, he has scored 125, 96, 91, 76 not out, 91, 10, and 154, averaging over 100 runs per innings. Having watched him closely in all these masterpieces, I, J.C. Davis, have no hesitation in placing the Macartney of 1912-13 on the same level of superlative excellence as the Trumper of 1902. Each is a genius. Trumper came first, and for that reason, showing all the radiance of a star, with tints of light hitherto unseen, he'll be remembered more vividly than Macartney, perhaps. But when you ponder on the handicap in height against which Macartney has to contend, compared with Trumper, you must acknowledge that the beauty and brilliance and power and the placing of his vast array of strokes are just phenomenal. No other batsman, English or colonial, save Trumper, has ever shown such sparkling form in a series of matches in this country. Not even Ranjinsky, the one great rival in the art to Trumper, produced by the Northern Hemisphere, has distinguished himself in Australia. And though A.C. McLaren was a veritable George Grey of the Green Award of Sydney, and far greater than can ever be imagined by any man who didn't see him play here, he never showed anything quite comparable with the Macartney acts. Aubrey Faulkner and Jack Hobbs were masters too, but even at their best, they had not the hum, the electric dash of Macartney. He is as good as Trumper ever was. I wonder where he gets the power from, asked an old cricketer with enthusiasm on the Sydney suburban train the other day. He was talking of Macartney and looked at me, J.C. Davis, looked at me for a reply. Have you never seen him in the dressing room? I asked. No, said he. Ah, said I, if you once saw that little man, as you call him, stripped to the buff, a la Jack Reed, you would no longer wonder where the power came from. As a matter of fact, Charlie Macartney is a model in build, very short, it is true, but built on lines of strength.
Mm, that's fairly conclusive.
Pretty conclusive. There are
Yeah.
other occasions, though, when J.C. Davis uh, separates the two and gives the nod to Trumper,
Mm,
but he does do so, acknowledging that Charlie uh, has the limitation of height as being a factor in his batting.
yeah. No, it's all very interesting and fascinating to consider when we look back at this time and how Trumper just seems to dominate the period. And I think rightfully so. He's placed on a pedestal for good reason, and we certainly don't want to knock that pedestal down, but we have to consider all the other players and where they stood. And yeah, I certainly wanted to ask you about his stature in the game at that point of time, because we've now come to the point in the podcast where we discuss statistics. And you very rightfully at the top of this podcast discussed or broke down McCartney's statistics in the early part of his career. So we're now just going to discuss Charlie Macartney's overall statistics, and I'm just going to read the numbers. So he made his first test, as we've already discussed, in the first test against England of the 1907-08 Ashes series. He plays his final test in the fifth test at the Oval of the 1926 tour. And his first-class career spans about 22 seasons. And we have to, of course, consider the disruption of the First World War, right smack bang in the middle of that period. So, like many Golden Agers, we have to break Charlie's record into bowling and batting. So his batting record, he played 35 tests, 55 innings. He only had 4 not outs, which might seem low, but he was, of course, usually at the top of the order. He made 2,131 runs. His highest score was that famous 170 at the Sydney Cricket Ground. He had a batting average of 41.78. Again, to modern ears, that might seem quite low, but for the time, that was very, very reasonable, impressive. He scored 7 centuries in his 35 test matches, 9 half centuries, and he took 17 catches. At a first class level, he was just shy of 250 matches, 360 innings, 32 not outs. He scored just over 15,000 runs, highest score of 345, which I'll touch on shortly. And he had a superior first-class batting average, as was often the case, of 45.78. And he just missed out on 50 first-class centuries. He had 49, and he scored 53 half centuries in first-class cricket, taking 102 catches. The bowling side of things, he took 45 wickets in his 35 test matches. Best bowling figures for an innings, 7 for 58. And his best figures for a match were the 11 for 85, which I mentioned earlier. On 2 occasions, he took 5 wickets in an innings, and once he took 10 wickets for the match. His first-class record for bowling, in those 249 matches, he took 419 wickets, costing 8,782 runs. And again, best bowling figures were what he did in the match, 7 for 58. And his bowling average in first-class cricket was 20.95, which is very impressive. On 17 occasions, he took 5 wickets in an innings. A couple of things to note, Peter, is that he was the... he might not like us mentioning this, but he was the 3rd Test batsman to be dismissed for 99, which happened in the Triangular tournament, and he followed in the footsteps of Clem Hill and George Faulkner. But one of the things he is remembered for, well, I suppose there are probably 2 things which modern cricket fans might know Charlie Macartney for, and that is his blistering 345, which he hit in a single day, mind you, on the 1921 tour of England. And that record was not surpassed for decades in terms of runs in a single day. 345, which remained his highest ever first-class score. And possibly the other thing he's remembered for is replicating Victor Trumper in scoring a century before lunch. And for many, many years was just one of 3 or 4 batsmen to do it. And he's in pretty good company with Trumper and Bradman to achieve that. Anything you want to add to these numbers, Peter?
I think the 3 Test centuries he scored in 1926 probably were the culmination of his career. He was honoured in many ways on that final tour of England for that performance, those performances. Each of the innings, particularly the first two, were scintillating, and so many accolades were given to him by both the English and the Australian press broadcasters as well. So, yeah, but you've captured the others quite well. I noticed that if I could tell the audience or the listeners, you were gracious enough to buy one of the
Yes, happy
McCartney
to.
books, and you wanted number 99. I think more for Clem Hill than
Well,
for Charlie, perhaps.
Well, I'm sure Clem and Charlie don't like us labouring on the fact that they were dismissed for 99. Of course, Clem did it a few times around the late 90s, but yeah, it is funny with cricket statistics how we do seem to latch on to these individual scores. Who knows whether Charlie gave it a second thought, but surely no one
Well,
likes to be dismissed for 99.
Charlie labours the point that he was out on several occasions in first class cricket in the 90s, and he talks about how it was a meaningless statistic to get to that three-figure mark. I think it's not really. I think he probably doesn't feel quite that adamant about it, but he does talk about the fact that uh, to to make the first 10 runs in an innings is more difficult than the last 10 before you hit the century mark, because you're well and truly set, etc., etc. So um, he actually spends a couple of pages in his biography talking about that fact. There were, particularly in the first class arena, there were, uh, I'd say, probably 10 innings within the 90s that could have gone into the hundreds, which would have made a little bit of a difference in terms of the face appeal of his statistics, so to speak.
Yeah, very interesting. And we can analyze and pull apart statistics all day and contemplate what ifs and what may have beens, but these are now locked in history. And
That's
um,
true. I think the maybe a contemporary analysis might be Michael Slater, who, but at Test match level, also scored a number of nineties in his career.
yes, and then we can't ignore the fact I think Victor Trumper wasn't dismissed at all in the 90s, so he was a very good converter in terms of and what do we make of that? Had Trumper not scored a few of the centuries and been dismissed in the 90s, perhaps his legacy would be different, but that's a whole nother discussion, and it
I
is
think
only
there's
speculation.
Sure. I think there is quite an argument to put that it's fictional to suggest that Victor Trumper was disinterested in his run making. He was very knowledgeable about where he stood in terms of centuries, etc., etc. And I think a more deep set analysis of that would be a useful starting point for any genuine biography of that man.
I Yes, and someone should take you up on that
Someone should
suggestion,
do
Peter.
that.
So, as we near the conclusion of this podcast on Charlie Macartney, we can't leave without discussing his legacy, and certainly, although we've done it already, touch on his post-war career. That is after the end of the so-called Golden Age. How did his batting and bowling differ in the post-war years, Peter?
So he was far more consistent with the bat, as we suggested. His average of 73 compared to mid 20s is remarkable transformation, and he was on top of his game. And if he wasn't in a state of mental anguish, he was phenomenally difficult to get out. He never lost any of his daring, even though as he matured and batted higher in the order, he practiced less with the ball. As a consequence, I think he lost some of his zip and bite off the pitch. but he remained extraordinarily accurate in line and length. So even though his batting was obviously his primary statement on the field, his bowling was still a useful adjunct. Um, and particularly at grade level, he was always head and shoulders above all of the bowlers and batsmen throughout his career at Gordon, and often was the most significant all-rounder across the Sydney competition.
Mm. And what did Charlie Macartney do after retiring from cricket altogether?
In his last will and testament, Charles described himself as a journalist. He retired from his clerical job with the New South Wales Railways in 1925. He had been working there, apart from during the war years, since about 1912. Um, he used some of his 1927 testimonial monies to buy a share in Bert Oldfield's sports depot in Sydney, which allowed him to travel around Australia and to the UK to watch cricket and write about events in the middle for a variety of English and Australian newspapers and magazines. And he retained a strong interest in the Gordon District Cricket Club without being a member of any of the committees. He played local tennis left handed and golf right handed at a highly competitive level until well into his 60s.
And Peter, as a returning guest to the podcast, and of course as a keen fan of the show, which I know you are, thank you. You won't be surprised by this final question, which is what would you think Charlie would make of modern cricket in terms of T20 and day-night cricket and women's cricket? How would he view all that, do you think?
He would have loved it. He lived and breathed cricket. He would have been in his element in the shorter forms of the game with both bat and ball and in the field. He thought very highly of women's cricket, and in the 1930s, he coached several future Australian women representatives, including Margaret Peden, who was to become Australia's first women's Test captain in 1934. So, short form cricket, Charlie, match made in heaven.
Excellent. Well, Peter, thank you very much again for joining me on the podcast. I'm sure my listeners have enjoyed getting to know another one of your subjects, this time on Charlie Macartney, of course, which go along with your previous biographies on Warren Bardsley and Monty Noble. And for anyone who hasn't listened to the Monty Noble podcast, that of course is available to listen at any time. And I trust your biography, Charlie Macartney, Mayhem and Artistry, will be excellently received and reviewed, as all your work is. Can I cheekily ask what is next for you, Peter?
So, a fellow a Sydney sider, Pat Rogers, and I are doing a shorter a monograph uh, on Bert Folkard, the New South Wales cricketer who unfortunately was one of those who suffered from the um, onset of the First World War and missed out on the opportunity of touring South Africa and probably playing Test cricket for Australia. He was a remarkable man and one of Charlie's great idols when Charlie first hit the scene in grade cricket. Bert was playing for Callum Park, an agency which often played against some of the Sydney grade clubs, did very well at that, and then was enticed to play grade cricket for Balmain and went on to play several matches for New South Wales. In fact, Charlie at one point captained Bert, and Bert captained Charlie on a different occasion. So Sydney cricket in those years was a motley situation where a lot of teams who were having a bye would play against Callum Park, and they had quite a successful era. And Bert was a man of attacking form, both with bat and ball. Charlie admired him a lot. So that's on the agenda at the moment, and
Hmm.
maybe another Golden Ager biography a little down the track.
Well, that's very enticing, I'm sure, for my listeners. But thanks again for being a guest today.
Thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure. And that's all for this episode. Thanks for joining me. If you'd like to listen to any previous episode of the series, please follow or subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform, follow the YouTube page, or perhaps buy me a coffee to help sustain the series into the future. My name is Tom Ford. Thanks for your company. Until next time, it's bye for now.